In this video, we're going to show you how to use the texture toolpath. Now this toolpath uses a specialised toolpath algorithm and the shape of the tool to generate a textured finish. It's very much an interactive toolpath that you can really play with, where you have lots of options in the form to control the textures that you can create. Now we're going to look at several examples to help educate and inspire you to create textures in your CNC projects. So let's just go to File, Close. Let's open an existing file. We're going to open example texture 1. Okay then, so we're going to jump straight over into our Toolpaths tab. So the texture tool can be found over here under Toolpath Operations, and it's your texturing toolpath. When you click on that, that will open up the texture toolpath, which gives you all of the options in order for us to control the textures that we can create. Now, if you don't have any vectors selected, it will apply the texture across the whole of your job. So we're going to do that to begin with, just to get used to how this toolpath works. So first off, you need to specify your tool. Currently, we have a 1/4 inch ball nose selected from our tool database. Okay, so we're going to go with that 1/4 inch ball nose. As always, if you want to edit any of the settings for this tool for this particular toolpath that we're creating here, then what you can do is you can use the edit option, and then in there you can make the changes to your feeds and speeds or your cutting parameters, and it will only affect the tool according to this particular toolpath that we're creating, and it won't have any effect on the stored database information that you've got for that tool. Okay, so next up, specify your start depth. So start depth in this case, we're going to set that at 0, which is the top surface of our material. Let's say you had already created a pocket, then you'd need to enter how far into the pocket you've already cut into this section here, and we'll look at an example of that shortly. And then working our way down, next up we've got this option here, use selected vectors as pattern. So by default that's always switched off. Now if you had vectors that you wanted to use as your pattern, then you'd check that option, and we're going to look at that shortly, so we'll come back to this one. And then we've got all of the fun stuff here, and so this is where we can really change and customize how we want our textures to be created. So just going to go through each of these settings. So first up, we've got the option to specify the maximum cut depth. So as it says, this is where we choose the maximum depth that we want to cut down. So for example, if we made that 0.3, we're saying to the software, I want a maximum of 0.3, but then you can specify the minimum cut depth as well. And so you can use the slider like so, and you can see what that says. So here you can see we've got that at 0.165, so it's going to cut at a minimum of 0.165 but a maximum of 0.3. Working our way down the form, okay, now we specify the maximum cut length. So for example, if you wanted the cut length, the maximum length here to be 3 inches, and then a minimum length here to be, let's say, 1 inch, we could go ahead and just kind of put that in there like so. Then we have the overlap. So this is how much we overlap each scallop that we cut. So the maximum overlap is specified as a percentage of the maximum cut length that each scallop is allowed to overlap. So as an example, 1% will result in almost 0 overlap of the adjacent scallops, and 50% will result in some of the scallops being machined halfway over the adjacent scallop. And then we've got the variation slider. So this will control how varied those overlaps are. So this is specified as a percentage of the maximum overlap. And so the overlap variation of 100% would give you maximum overlap and a random pattern, whereas an overlap variation of, say, 1% would result in no overlap and pretty much a constant pattern. So let's just set that to around 50% in there. Then we've got the step over. So this is the distance between each parallel set of lines of carved scallops that we're going to create. So we're just going to leave that there. And then we've got the angle option. So the angle, so at 0 it's parallel to the x-axis, and then at 90 it's parallel to the y-axis, and everything in between will create your angle. Right then, so let's just go ahead and press calculate just to see what the effect is of the settings that we used there. So here we could go ahead and preview that, and you can see what we've got here. So you can see we've got long, lengths in here, so that's a maximum length there of kind of 3 inches, and you can see it's creating smaller scallops in between. And you can see we've got varied depth in there as well. That looks pretty good, so you've got a nice kind of effect there. And what you could do is you could undo and then go back in and then just tweak with the settings again. So for example, if you wanted a much smaller kind of texture, so let's say we make that 1 inch length instead, you can change that. Let's say we just go ahead and totally up the variation there, and then go ahead and press calculate and preview that. And you can see we get a much different effect there as well. And so really this tool is pretty much about playing with the different settings, trying out different tools as well. Obviously the tool will have an effect, so if you used a V-bit tool that would look different as well. But now we're going to look at a different example. So we're just going to close out here, and then we're just going to go ahead and we'll just delete that toolpath. And then we're going to go into our layers tab, and we're just going to turn off layer 1, and we're going to switch on our wave layer, and we're just going to go to our preview, and we're just going to reset that preview there. Okay, and we'll just put that back into the top view. So let's go back into the texture toolpath tool. So before we move on, it's probably worth mentioning that if you did like a setting that you had in here, then you can always save that setting using the save option. And that will open up your vector textures folder that is stored on your machine, in which case you can save that out. So for example, we could call this one, that's based on what we created earlier, and then we could just go ahead and save it. And then if we wanted to load in that texture that we saved, we can use the load option, and you can see here we've got these small scallops there, which is really handy because then it just means that you don't need to remember all the settings that you used before that you liked the effects of those settings. Right then, so now we're going to look at a different option whereby we're going to use selected vectors as a pattern. So we're going to take these vectors that we've got here, so let's just select all of those vectors there, like so. We're going to use this option, use selected vectors as a pattern. So you'll see it will grey out some of the options here. So what do we have available? Well, we'll come back to ramp at start and end in a second, but we have the ability to adjust the maximum cut depth and the minimum cut depth. And the really nice thing about this toolpath on using it on vectors is that we can create varying cut depths, which is perfect if you wanted to really create a differentiating pattern. So again, let's just go with the settings that we've got here, and then we'll just go ahead and press calculate, and then what we'll do is we'll just go ahead and preview that. We should be able to see the effect of that. Okay, so if we take a look over here, we can see that we are actually cutting in deeper in some places and shallower in others, and so we're really creating a nice varied effect there, which is useful if you're wanting to kind of just break up the pattern. So let's just reset that, and then we're just going to close out here. We're going to go back into the texture tool, and now we're going to look at the effect of applying a ramp at the start and end. And so this option essentially creates a kind of flute, so it will kind of ramp in at the start, do its cut, and then ramp out at the end, so you get somewhat of a nice effect if you wanted the kind of fluted effect. So we'll just go ahead and calculate that just to see the effect of that, and then we'll go ahead and preview that, so you can see it's fluting in like so, and then it flutes out. So it's just a real nice different effect there. You can see that looks pretty nice. And again, I've obviously got the difference in the variation of our depth of cut as well. That looks pretty good. Let's just put that back to the top there, and then we'll just close out. So So now we're just going to close out here and we're going to look at opening a new file whereby we're going to look at how we can combine the textures with other toolpaths in a sine example. So we're just going to switch over to our toolpaths and let's just preview all the toolpaths that we've got to begin with. So we'll preview all the toolpaths. Okay, so here we've just got a simple sine, we've got a pocket here, and so that's creating this raised rocket text, and the idea is we want to create a texture inside of the pocket. So let's just jump into the pocket and we can see we've already cut down 0.125, so we must remember this number here. So then when we go into the texture toolpath, what we need to do is we need to specify our start depth. So we want to put in our start depth here of 0.125 in this case, because we've already cut down that amount, and so we want it to start from this cut depth that we've got here. Now before I jump ahead, what I want to do is actually want to change the tool. So we're going to go in here, we're going to change this to an 1/8 inch bull nose, and we'll just select that. Okay, and so the idea is we're going to create a texture toolpath with an 1/8 inch bull nose at a start depth of 1/8 of an inch in between the vectors that we've got selected here. So working our way down the form, we can now have a look at all of the different settings that we've got in here. So I'm just going to alter the maximum cut depth to 0.03. And then we're just going to go to the maximum cut length here. We're just going to half that to 0.5. And then we're also going to alter the minimum length. So we're just going to increase that slightly to say 1/4 of an inch. So maximum cut of 1/2 an inch, minimum at 1/4. In terms of the overlap, let's just reduce that to 20%. And then in terms of the variation there, let's just make that kind of halfway. And then in terms of our step over, let's just heavily reduce that to 0.05. And then the angle, we're just going to leave that at 0. And then we're going to go ahead and press calculate. Okay, so we can go ahead and preview that. And we can see straight away it's actually eating into our text and into our border, which is not ideal, but we do have a solution for that. So let's just undo that. We're going to go back into the texture toolpath and we're going to look at this option here where we can create a boundary vector offset. And so what we do is we assign an offset between the inside of this main shape here and then to the text. So we're going to create almost like a halo effect so that we don't have that tool run into the edge. Obviously the center of the tool runs up to the vectors that we've got selected here, and so by specifying a boundary offset we can kind of reduce that. So as we're using an 1/8 inch tool, I'm actually going to look at applying an offset of around 0.07 there, and then we could go ahead and press calculate now. And then we could go ahead and preview that toolpath and we can see now it's not eating into the text, it's not eating into the actual boundary. And you can see we've got a real nice effect there. We've got a subtle halo, but it's much better than the result that we had before. And so using that option when you're working with sine work like this is perfect, and it's ideal for when you're wanting to incorporate textures into other toolpaths. Now if you had a 3D part and you wanted to create a texture that followed the 3D model, then you can make use of this option here to project the toolpath onto the 3D model. And what it will do is it will project the toolpath to the contours of the 3D part that you've got in your job. So hopefully that's everything you need to know about the texture toolpath. Thank you for watching.